What would you do if you were abandoned on a dead planet where every breath is a fight, and the only soul you meet is the one the universe taught you to fear? Welcome to X-47, a wasteland of jagged scars and whispering winds, where Kalia, an alien outcast, stumbles upon something impossible, a human carving hope from the wreckage. His hands build shelter from stone and steel, but is he her salvation, or the final trap in this endless dark? Stick around, because this story will hook you until the stars burn out. If you crave sci-fi tales packed with tension, action, and raw emotion, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss what's coming next. Ring the bell so you're the first to dive into this brutal, beautiful world. Let's step into the unknown together, starting now. X-47, a graveyard of dust and plasma. The sky above X-47 burned with a sickly glow, streaked with ribbons of pale green plasma that tore through the blackness like open wounds. It wasn't a sky meant for life. It was a shroud, vast and unyielding, swallowing every trace of warmth as dusk bled into night. The air hung heavy, thick with the sharp tang of scorched metal and something older, something decayed, as if the planet itself exhaled the ghosts of its forgotten past. Wind howled across the broken terrain, a relentless wail that scraped against jagged cliffs and twisted through the fissures, splitting the ground. It carried dust in its teeth, fine and gray, settling into every crevice like ash from a fire long extinguished. This was no place for the living. This was a graveyard, and X-47 wore its name like a curse. Beneath that unforgiving sky, the land stretched out in a brutal expanse of ruin. Cracked earth spread wide, its surface marred by deep, ragged gashes, old wounds carved by time and neglect. Here and there, sparse clumps of wiry vegetation clung to life, their thorns glinting like tiny blades under the faint plasma light. They weren't plants born of nurture. They were survivors, hostile and sharp, as if the planet had birthed them despite anything foolish enough to linger. Scattered among the rocks were the bones of a lost era, rusted steel beams jutting from the dirt, remnants of an abandoned mining outpost left to rot centuries ago. The skeletal husks of machinery loomed in the distance, half buried by shifting dunes, their edges softened by erosion, but still jagged enough to cut. Every gust of wind rattled them, a hollow clang echoing across the desolation, a reminder that even the works of sentient hands couldn't tame this place. The atmosphere pressed down like a weight, thin and dry, forcing lungs to labor for every breath. Each inhale tasted bitter, laced with a metallic bite that coated the tongue and lingered in the throat, a flavor of rust and ruin, as if the air itself had been forged in some ancient, dying engine. The temperature swung wildly. Blistering heat by day gave way to a bone-chilling cold as night crept in, the kind of cold that sank into flesh and refused to let go. Shadows danced across the landscape, thrown by the flickering plasma above, twisting the terrain into a maze of illusions. A glint of metal might be a shard of wreckage, or the glinting eyes of something watching, waiting. 4X-47 wasn't truly empty. Beyond the silence, beyond the wind, there were whispers of movement, soft, skittering sounds that hinted at life too cunning to show itself. Nightclaws, they were called, though no one knew their true name. Predators born of this hellscape, patient and ruthless, their presence a constant threat lurking just out of sight. Once, this planet had been a prize, a mining hub teeming with ships and ambition. Now it was a prison, a dumping ground for the unwanted, the exiled, the condemned. The galaxy had turned its back, leaving X-47 to fester in its own decay. The plasma storms that lit the sky weren't natural. They were scars of exploitation, residue from machines that had stripped the planet bare before breaking under their own greed. What remained was a husk, a world that didn't forgive weakness or reward hope. Every crack in the ground, every groan of rusted steel told the same story. Survival here wasn't a gift. It was a defiance, a scream against the void. And yet, Amid the desolation, something stirred. A faint, rhythmic sound cut through the wind's howl. Not the skitter of claws, not the creak of ruin, but something deliberate. Metal struck metal, a steady beat rising from the shadows of a jagged cliffside, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat in a corpse. It was impossible, unthinkable. X-47 was a place to die, not to build. Yet there it was, a sound that didn't belong, a spark of purpose in a land stripped of meaning. The wind carried it closer, sharp and clear, pulling the listener toward its source. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, they weren't just surviving. They were claiming this wasteland, bending it to their will. And in that moment, beneath the plasma-streaked sky, the first thread of a story began to unravel. A story of exile, of defiance, and of something neither the planet nor the stars could predict. The wind of X-47 carved its relentless path across the wasteland, tugging at the tattered remains of Kalia's cloak as she stumbled forward, her boots sinking into the cracked, ashen soil. She was a shadow against the faint green glow of the plasma-streaked sky, a lone figure dwarfed by the vast, merciless expanse. Her eyes, twin emeralds blazing with a strange, bioluminescent light, cut through the gloom, sharp and unyielding despite the exhaustion that weighed her down. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale metallic sheen that caught the plasma's flicker like a star fallen to this forsaken rock. It wasn't the warm gold of human flesh or the dull gray of stone. It was something otherworldly, a mark of her Zarathian blood, a lineage she'd once worn with pride. Now, that pride was a wound, raw and bleeding, just like the gash at her hip where dark red blood seeped through torn fabric, staining the silvery glow of her flesh. Kalia's breaths came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the thin, bitter air. The metallic tang coated her tongue, a taste she'd grown to hate in the days, or was it weeks, since she'd been cast down to this hell. Her right hand gripped a crude sword, forged from a jagged shard of her crashed ship's hull. Its edge was rough, pitted with dents from the wreckage she'd pried it from. But it was hers, a lifeline in a place that offered none. Her left arm hung limp, aching from the crash that had flung her into this nightmare. She could still feel the phantom weight of the ship's controls, the jolt as it spiraled through X-47's atmosphere, the fire that roared around her as she clawed her way free. She'd survived that. She'd survived this too. She had to. Her cloak fluttered as she paused, leaning against a slab of rusted steel half buried in the dirt. The cold bit in her palms, but she barely noticed. Pain was an old friend now, a constant companion since the day her own people had turned their backs on her. The memory surged unbidden, sharp as the wind cutting through her. The council chamber high above the clouds of Zorith Prime, its walls gleaming with silver and glass, its air humming with the pulse of machinery. She'd stood before them, bruised and defiant, her armor dented from a battle she'd fought harder than any of them. "You are defective," they'd said, their voices cold, mechanical, stripped of the emotion they'd bred out of their kind generations ago. A liability, too weak to serve the collective. She'd begged, not for mercy, but for a chance to prove them wrong. They hadn't listened. They'd stripped her rank, her name, her purpose, and hurled her into exile on X-47, a death sentence disguised as judgment. Defective, she muttered under her breath, the word a bitter hiss lost to the wind. Her fingers tightened around the sword's hilt, knuckles whitening beneath her shimmering skin. They were wrong. She wasn't weak. She'd pulled herself from the wreckage, fought off the first nightclaw that had come for her in the dark, its claws raking her hip before she drove her blade through its skull. She'd walked through the storms, the cold, the hunger, every step a defiance of their verdict. Her kind prized control, precision, a mind unclouded by feeling. Kalia had never fit that mold. She felt too much, anger, fear, hope, and they called it flaw. Now that flaw was the fire keeping her alive. She sank to one knee beside the steel slab, the ache in her body finally forcing her to stop. The wound at her hip throbbed, a dull pulse that matched the rhythm of her heart. She couldn't keep moving like this, not without tending to it. With a grimace, she let the sword clatter to the ground and tugged at the remnants of her cloak. The fabric tore easily, revealing more of her metallic skin, its faint glow stark against the dark blood crusting her side. She peeled the cloth away, wincing as it stuck to the wound, then tossed it aside. Her hands moved slowly, almost reverently, as she traced the injury, a jagged tear where the nightclaw's claw had caught her. The pain flared, but she bit her lip, refusing to cry out. Not here. Not where the wind might carry her weakness to whatever else lurked in the shadows. Her fingers brushed her skin, cool to the touch despite the heat of her blood, and she shivered, not from cold, but from the raw vulnerability of the moment. She reached for a strip of fabric she'd salvaged from the ship, her breath hitching as she pressed it against the wound. The pressure stung, and her chest rose and fell faster, each exhale a faint mist in the frigid air. Her skin gleamed brighter under the plasma's light, the metallic sheen rippling as her muscles tensed. She tied the makeshift bandage tight, her hands trembling slightly, and for a fleeting second she let them linger there, feeling the steady pulse beneath her flesh. Alive. She was still alive. The thought was a quiet triumph, a spark in the endless dark. Kalia lifted her gaze, those emerald eyes scanning the horizon once more. She wasn't safe. Not yet. The nightclaws hunted at night, and the plasma storms could strike without warning. She needed shelter, food, something to keep her going. Her kind didn't tire easily, but even Zarathian endurance had its limits, and she was pushing hers to the edge. She retrieved her sword, the weight familiar in her grip, and forced herself to stand. The pain shot through her hip, but she swallowed it down, her jaw clenching with resolve. She walked too far to fall now. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A rhythmic clang, metal striking metal, faint but steady, rising from the direction of a jagged cliffside shrouded in dust. Her head snapped toward it, eyes narrowing. On X-47, anything alive was a threat. Her people had warned her of humans, reckless, violent creatures driven by instinct, not reason. Could one of them be here, in this wasteland? Her grip tightened, and she took a cautious step forward, the wound forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. Whatever it was, she'd face it. She always had. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal grew louder as Kalia crept closer, her boots crunching softly against the brittle, ash-strewn ground. The sound was a lifeline in the suffocating silence of X-47, pulling her forward despite the ache in her hip and the weight of her crude sword. She edged along a jagged cliffside, its surface rough with eroded stone and flecked with rust from forgotten machinery. The plasma-streaked sky cast a faint, eerie glow, just enough to silhouette the source of the noise ahead. Her emerald eyes narrowed, sharp and wary, as she pressed herself against the rock, peering around its edge. What she saw stopped her cold. There, in a shallow hollow carved by wind and time, stood a man, a human. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his frame solid against the desolation around him. His shirt was gone, discarded somewhere in the dirt, leaving his torso bare under the flickering light. Sweat glistened on his bronze skin, tracing paths down the taut lines of muscle as he worked. His arms flexed with each movement, hands steady and sure as he hefted a slab of jagged steel and slotted it into a half-built structure, a makeshift shelter of stone and scavenged metal. Dark hair clung messily to his forehead, damp with exertion, and a faint scar ran along his jaw, a thin white line catching the plasma's glow. He didn't look like the wild, reckless humans her people had warned her about. He looked deliberate, focused, almost defiant in the way he shaped this wasteland to his will. Kalia's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her sword. She'd never seen a human in the flesh, only heard tales from the Zarathian archives, stories of a species driven by chaos and violence. Yet here he was, building something where nothing should stand, his every motion a quiet rebellion against X-47's death sentence. She shifted her weight, careful not to let her boots scrape the gravel. But a loose stone betrayed her, tumbling down the incline with a sharp clatter. The man froze, his head tilting slightly as if he'd sensed her long before the sound. Then, without turning, he spoke. "Staring's free," he said, his voice deep and rough, shaped by days, or maybe years, of solitude. "But if you're here to take what's mine, you'll have to try harder than that." Kalia tensed, her sword half raised, ready for a fight. He straightened slowly, rolling his shoulders as he turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes, dark, piercing, scanning her in one swift, assessing glance. Up close, he was even more imposing, his presence filling the hollow like a storm held in check. Dirt streaked his chest, smudging the hard lines of muscle, and his hands, calloused and steady, brushed dust from his pants as he stepped forward. His gaze lingered on her, on the torn cloak, the shimmer of her metallic skin, the blood staining her side, before locking onto her eyes. There was no fear in him, no madness, just a quiet calculation that unnerved her more than any threat could. She didn't lower her blade. "I don't need your pity, human," she said, her voice cold, edged with the defiance that had kept her alive. He huffed a short breath, almost a laugh, tilting his head slightly. "Good. I don't have any to give." He wiped sweat from his brow, the motion slow and deliberate, drawing her eyes to the flex of his arm, the way his skin gleamed under the faint light. It was a distraction she didn't want, an awareness that crept under her guard, quickening her pulse despite herself. She forced her gaze back to his face, catching the faintest quirk of his lips, a ghost of amusement that made her jaw clench. "You're not from here," he said, stepping closer, just one step, but enough to shrink the space between them. His voice was steady, probing. "What's whatever you are doing on a rock like this?" Kalia bristled, her grip tightening. "I could ask you the same, human. Your kind doesn't belong here." He raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Yeah, well, neither does yours, I'd bet." He gestured vaguely at her sword, then at the wound she couldn't hide. "Looks like you've had a rough landing. Still standing, though. That's something." She hated that he saw it, the limp she tried to mask, the blood she couldn't stop. "I don't need your help," she snapped, her tone sharper than she meant it to be. He didn't flinch, just ran a hand through his damp hair, pushing it back from his face. Didn't offer any. His eyes flicked over her again, slower this time, tracing the curve of her shoulder where the cloak had slipped, the shimmer of her skin catching the light. Her breath hitched, a flush of heat rising under his stare, and she turned her head sharply, trying to shake off the feeling. He noticed, of course he did, and that faint smirk returned, subtle but there, like he knew exactly what he'd done. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. He turned back to his structure, lifting another slab of stone as if she weren't still standing there, watching him like a predator sizing up prey. "Name's Elias," he said over his shoulder, his tone casual now. "If that matters to you. Shelter's not much, but it's mine. Stay or go, I don't care. Just don't expect me to roll out a welcome mat." Kalia's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed to her to walk away, to vanish into the dark and trust no one, least of all a human. She'd survived alone this long, through the crash, the night claws, the storms. But the wound at her hip pulsed, a reminder of her limits, and the distant howl of the wind promised worse to come. Night was falling, and with it, the hunters of X-47 would rise. She lowered her sword, not fully, just enough to signal a truce, and took a cautious step forward. "Temporary," she muttered, her voice low, reluctant. "That's all." Elias glanced back, his smirk fading into something unreadable. "Fair enough." He gestured toward the shelter with a tilt of his head, then resumed his work, the clang of metal echoing once more. Kalia followed, her steps slow, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't trust him. Not yet, but for now, this human and his stubborn defiance were her only anchor in the dark. The air on X-47 had a way of turning traitor without warning. One moment, it hung still and heavy, the silence broken only by the faint hum of plasma flickering overhead. The next, it stirred, a low, guttural murmur rolling across the wasteland, tugging at the edges of Kalia's cloak as she sat near the half-built shelter. She'd been there less than an hour, perched on a slab of stone, her emerald eyes fixed on Elias as he worked. His hands moved with relentless precision, stacking scavenged steel and rock into walls that defied the planet's decay. She didn't trust him, not yet, but there was something hypnotic in his focus, a stubbornness that matched her own. She'd almost let her guard slip when the wind changed. It started as a whisper, a distant rustle that sent fine dust swirling around her boots. Then it grew, a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through the ground, shaking loose pebbles from a cliffside. Kalia's head snapped up, her senses sharpening as the sky darkened. Not with night, but with something worse. A swirling mass of clouds surged on the horizon, pulsing with an unnatural electric glow, green and violet tendrils sparking within its depths. This wasn't a storm of rain or wind. This was a plasma vortex, a remnant of X-47's ruined past, a tempest of raw energy that could melt steel and shred flesh. She'd heard of them in her briefings, rare, deadly, and unforgiving. Her grip tightened on her sword, the wound at her hip throbbing as she stood. Elias noticed it too. He dropped the slab he'd been lifting, the metal clanging against the dirt as he turned to face the approaching chaos. His dark eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw tension ripple through his frame. "Damn it," he muttered, more to himself than to her, his voice rough with urgency. "Get inside now." Kalia bristled at the command, her pride flaring. "I can handle myself," she shot back. But even as the words left her lips, the wind surged, a deafening roar that drowned her voice. The air crackled with static, the hairs on her arms standing on end as the vortex bore down, its edges glowing hotter, brighter. Elias didn't argue. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unyielding, and yanked her toward the shelter. She stumbled, the sudden contact sending a jolt through her, but there was no time to protest. The storm was upon them. They ducked inside just as the first wave hit. The shelter shuddered, its walls groaning under the onslaught as plasma-charged wind slammed against the steel and stone. Kalia pulled free of Elias's grasp, her heart pounding, and pressed herself against the inner wall, peering out through a narrow gap. The world beyond had turned to madness. Gusts of searing air tore at the ground, flinging debris in wild arcs, while arcs of green lightning danced across the cliffs, illuminating the chaos in flashes. The temperature spiked, heat seeping through the cracks, and she felt sweat bead on her metallic skin, her cloak sticking to her back. "It won't hold like this," Elias shouted over the roar, his voice cutting through the din. He was already moving, grabbing a loose slab of steel from their meager stockpile. "Help me brace it, or we'll be buried." Kalia didn't hesitate. She'd survived too much to die under rubble. She darted to his side, ignoring the dull ache in her hip, and seized a chunk of stone. Together, they hauled it toward the entrance, where the wind howled loudest, threatening to rip the structure apart. Elias wedged his slab against the wall, muscles straining as he forced it into place, while Kalia shoved hers beside it, her hands scraping against the rough edges. The shelter shook again, a deep crack splitting the air as a bolt of plasma struck nearby, sending a shower of sparks through the gap. "Hold it steady," Elias yelled, leaning into the steel with his full weight. Kalia pressed her shoulder against the stone, her strength matching his, their bodies inches apart as they fought the storm's fury. Then it happened. A gust tore through, loosening a heavy beam above. It tipped, plummeting toward them, and Elias reacted first, lunging to catch it. His hands gripped the edge, but the weight drove him back, his boots sliding in the dirt. Kalia didn't think. She threw herself forward, her hands slamming against the beam beside his, their fingers brushing in the chaos. The heat of his skin burned against hers, a stark contrast to her cool, metallic touch, and for a split second, their eyes locked, his dark and fierce, hers blazing green. The beam steadied, but the space between them vanished. His arm pressed against her side, his breath hot and ragged against her cheek as they held it together. Time slowed, the storm's roar fading to a dull hum in her ears, replaced by the thud of her own pulse. His scent, sweat, dust, and something raw flooded her senses, and she felt a flush creep up her neck, unbidden and unwanted. "Push," he grunted, snapping her back to reality. She shoved with all she had, and they forced the beam upright, jamming it against the wall. The shelter stabilized, the wind's howl softening as their makeshift brace held. They stumbled back, breathless, collapsing against the inner wall side by side. The air still crackled outside, but the worst had passed for now. Kalia's chest heaved, her skin glistening with sweat under the faint plasma light filtering through the cracks. She glanced at Elias, his bare torso streaked with dirt, his breaths as labored as hers. He ran a hand through his damp hair, pushing it back, and caught her looking. "What?" he said, his voice rough but tinged with something lighter. Amusement, maybe. She turned away, her cheeks burning despite herself. "Nothing," she muttered, brushing dust from her cloak. But it wasn't nothing. That moment, their hands touching, his arm against her, the heat of him so close, lingered a spark she couldn't extinguish. Elias shifted, reaching for a battered flask from their supplies. He took a swig, then held it out to her, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. The contact was brief, deliberate, and she felt it again, that jolt, sharp and electric, racing up her arm. She drank, the water cool against her parched throat, but it did little to douse the warmth spreading through her. She handed it back, avoiding his gaze, but he didn't let it go unnoticed. "You're tougher than you look," he said, his tone casual but his eyes steady, searching hers. "Good to know." Kalia met his stare, her pride flaring anew. "I don't need you to tell me that." But there was no venom in it, not this time. She settled back against the wall, the flask still warm from his grip, and for the first time since landing on X-47, the silence between them didn't feel like a battlefield. Outside, the vortex raged on, but inside, something else was brewing, something neither of them could name yet. The plasma vortex had left its mark on X-47, though the storm had finally burned itself out. The air outside the shelter hung heavy with the scent of scorched earth and ozone, a faint hum lingering as the sky settled back into its eerie, streaked glow. Inside, the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the crackle of a small fire Kalia had coaxed to life from their dwindling supply of scavenged wood. She sat cross-legged near the flames, her crude sword resting across her knees, its jagged edge glinting in the dim light. Her emerald eyes flicked toward the entrance every few seconds, tracking the shadows beyond. Elias had been gone too long. He'd left just after the storm passed, muttering something about checking a water cache he'd hidden a mile out. "Won't take long," he'd said, slinging a battered pack over his shoulder, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Kalia hadn't argued. She wasn't his keeper, but the unease had settled in her chest the moment he disappeared into the dusk. She didn't trust this planet, its quiet moments as dangerous as its chaos. Nightclaws prowled in the dark, and the storms weren't the only threat X-47 hid. She shifted, wincing as the wound at her hip tugged, a reminder of her own vulnerability. She hated waiting, hated relying on anyone, least of all a human she barely knew. The sound came first, a faint scuff of boots against gravel, uneven and halting. Kalia was on her feet in an instant, sword in hand, her metallic skin catching the firelight as she moved to the entrance. Elias stumbled into view, his silhouette swaying against the jagged cliffside. Her breath caught as he stepped closer, the faint glow revealing the damage. His shirt hung in tatters, the left sleeve soaked dark with blood that dripped in slow, steady lines down his arm. Dirt streaked his face, his hair matted with sweat and grime, and a deep gash ran from his shoulder to his elbow, the skin around it swollen and bruised. He leaned against the shelter's frame, his chest heaving, but his grip on his knife was still firm, the blade stained with something black and slick. "What happened?" Kalia demanded, her voice sharp as she lowered her sword but didn't sheath it. Elias exhaled through his nose, a rough, pained sound, and dropped his knife onto the stone ledge beside the fire. "Ran into something unfriendly," he muttered, his fingers flexing briefly before clamping down on his injured arm. "I'll live." Kalia's eyes narrowed, stepping closer despite herself. His shirt was torn beyond repair, the fabric clinging to his skin where blood and sweat had fused it. The wound wasn't fresh. It had been bleeding for a while, long enough to slow him down. "You should have come back sooner," she said, her tone edged with frustration as she set her sword aside and reached for their meager supplies, a salvaged medkit she'd found in the wreckage days ago. He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, easing himself down against the wall. "Had things to do." His voice was strained, but that faint smirk flickered across his lips, infuriatingly stubborn even now. "Dying isn't one of them," she snapped, kneeling beside him. She grabbed his arm, ignoring his slight flinch, and tugged the ruined sleeve up. The gash was deep, the edges ragged. Not a clean cut, but the work of claws or teeth. A night claw, maybe, or something worse. She frowned, her fingers brushing the swollen skin as she assessed it. "This isn't an accident." Elias didn't answer right away, his head tipping back against the stone, eyes half closed. "Didn't say it was," he murmured, his breath shallow but steady. Kalia shot him a glare, but he didn't budge. She turned to the medkit, pulling out a silvery paste, some kind of antiseptic from her ship, and a strip of clean fabric. "Hold still," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. He cracked one eye open, watching her, but didn't resist as she worked. She tore the rest of his sleeve away, revealing the full expanse of his chest and arm. Dirt and blood marred his bronzed skin, but beneath it, the hard lines of muscle stood out, tense and unyielding despite his exhaustion. Her hands moved with precision, wiping away the grime with a damp cloth, her metallic fingers cool against his fevered warmth. She felt his pulse under her touch, strong but uneven, and her own quickened in response. She pressed the cloth to the wound, and he tensed, a low hiss escaping his lips as his jaw clenched. "Not used to being patched up by an alien," he said, his voice rough but tinged with something softer. Curiosity, maybe? She ignored the comment, focusing on the slow, steady motion of cleaning the gash. "Not used to patching up a human," she countered, her fingers brushing his skin as she spread the antiseptic paste. It gleamed under the firelight, sealing the wound with a faint sizzle. Elias barely flinched, but she felt the way he forced himself to stay still, his chest rising and falling faster under her hands. "Looks worse than it is," he muttered, his eyes locked on the fire now, avoiding her gaze. Kalia wasn't convinced. She finished with the paste, then reached for the fabric, wrapping it tightly around his arm. Her hands lingered, adjusting the bandage, and she couldn't help but notice the heat radiating from him. The raw, human warmth so different from her own cool touch. She tied it off, her fingers brushing his shoulder, and for a moment, she didn't pull away. His skin was rough under hers, marked by scars she hadn't seen before, and she felt a strange pull, an urge to trace them, to understand the story they told. "Why'd you come here?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Elias's gaze flicked to hers, dark and unreadable. "Same reason as you, I guess." He shifted, stretching his fingers as if testing the bandage. "Didn't fit where I was. They left me here to rot after I refused an order. Blowing up a colony full of civilians wasn't my idea of duty." Kalia's hand stilled, her eyes searching his. She hadn't expected that. A soldier with a conscience. "My people called me defective," she said after a beat, the words tasting bitter. "Too much feeling, not enough control." He smirked faintly, leaning back. "Sounds like we're both broken in their eyes." She didn't respond, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with something shared. She sat back on her heels, studying him, his tired face, the blood-streaked arm, the way he held himself together despite it all. He reached for the flask beside him, taking a slow sip, then offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it, their fingers brushing again. This time, he didn't let go right away, his grip lingering, his thumb grazing her knuckle. Her breath hitched, a flush creeping up her neck as his eyes met hers, steady and searching. "You saved my ass out there with the storm," he said, his voice low, real. "Guess I owe you." Kalia swallowed, handing the flask back, her skin tingling where he'd touched her. "I don't keep score," she said, but her voice softened, the edge gone. She settled beside him, the fire's warmth seeping into the space between them, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to pull away. The night on X-47 was never truly silent, but it had a rhythm, a low, restless hum of wind and distant echoes that Kalia had learned to read. She sat near the fire, her sword balanced across her knees, sharpening it with a salvaged stone. The steady scrape of metal against rock was a comfort, grounding her in the quiet hours since Elias's return. He sat across from her, his bandaged arm resting on his knee, his knife twirling absently in his good hand. The firelight flickered over his face, casting shadows across the scar on his jaw, and she caught herself watching him more than she meant to. The air between them had shifted since the storm, since she'd patched him up, less hostile, more charged, though neither would name it. That silence shattered without warning. The wind stilled, an unnatural hush falling over the shelter, and Kalia's hand froze mid-stroke. Her emerald eyes darted to the entrance, her senses prickling as the hairs on her neck stood on end. Elias felt it too. He stopped twirling his knife, his posture shifting, weight centered, eyes narrowing at the dark beyond. "You hear that?" he murmured, voice low. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The stillness was wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate. Then came the sound, a faint skitter of claws on stone, sharp and rapid, circling closer. Her grip tightened on her sword as she rose, slow and controlled, her metallic skin glinting in the fire's glow. Elias was up in an instant, knife ready, his injured arm flexing despite the pain. "Night claws," he breathed, the word a curse. The realization hit too late. A blur of motion erupted from the shadows, low, fast, and lethal. The first Nightclaw lunged at Elias, its skeletal frame a tangle of wiry limbs and razor claws, eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the dark. He twisted at the last second, driving his knife up, but the creature darted back, its screech piercing the air. Kalia spun as gravel shifted behind her, another shape coiling in the gloom, its body taut like a spring. These weren't the biggest predators on X-47, but they were the smartest, pack hunters, patient and cruel, striking only when the odds tipped in their favor. Tonight, they'd misjudged their prey. Kalia moved first. She lunged at the nearest one, closing the distance before it could react, her sword slicing through the air. The blade caught its shoulder, tearing a gash that sprayed black ichor across the stone, and it shrieked, leaping back. The pack responded, a chorus of snarls as two more charged Elias. He dodged the first, stepping sideways and slamming his forearm into its ribs, then drove his knife into its neck. The impact sent them crashing to the dirt, the creature thrashing as he yanked the blade free. Kalia barely registered it. Her own opponent struck, claws swiping at her chest. She ducked, the tips raking her cloak, and rolled low, driving her sword up into its jaw. It convulsed, legs kicking, then fell still. No time to breathe. A larger shape loomed from the side, faster than the others, its claws gleaming as it barreled toward her. She turned, but too late. The impact slammed her to the ground, knocking the air from her lungs. The Nightclaw pinned her, its weight crushing, claws digging into her arms as she struggled. Its snarl was too close, hot breath against her face, yellow eyes boring into hers. She thrashed, trying to free her sword, but it was trapped beneath her, and the beast was too strong. Panic flared, sharp and unfamiliar. She was caught. "Get down!" Elias roared, his voice cutting through her haze. She twisted her head, glimpsing him charging, but the Nightclaw pinning her didn't budge. He shouted again, "Kalia, hide now!" Her pride surged, drowning the fear. "I'm not human to cower like a weakling," she yelled back, her voice raw as she kicked against the creature's underside. "I can fight." Elias didn't hesitate. He laughed, a wild, reckless sound, and nodded. "Then prove it." She did. With a surge of strength, she wrenched one arm free, slamming her fist into the Nightclaw's throat. It recoiled just enough for her to roll, grabbing her sword and slashing upward in one fluid motion. The blade tore through its belly, spilling ichor across her chest, and it collapsed with a gurgling screech. She staggered to her feet, breathing hard, just as Elias dispatched another, his knife buried in its skull. But the fight wasn't over. A final Nightclaw, bigger, faster, leapt from the shadows, aiming for Kalia. She raised her sword, but it was too quick, knocking her back. She hit the ground again, the beast's claws pinning her shoulders, its snarling maw inches from her throat. She fought, muscles straining, but it held firm. Then, suddenly, its weight lifted, a sharp, brutal jerk as Elias tackled it off her. He drove his knife into its side, dragging it down with him as they rolled across the dirt. The Nightclaw spasmed, its claws slashing wildly, then went still as he yanked the blade free. Silence fell, broken only by their ragged breaths. Kalia pushed herself up, her shoulders stinging where claws had grazed her, her cloak torn. Elias rose too, his jacket shredded, blood and dirt streaking his arms, but he stood steady, scanning the dark for more. None came. It was over. He turned to her, chest heaving, his eyes sharp as they swept over her. "You good?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice rough with exertion. Kalia nodded, rolling her shoulder to test it. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice wavered, the adrenaline still pumping. He didn't look convinced. Before she could protest, he closed the gap, his hand brushing her shoulder near the torn fabric. His touch was careful, skimming her metallic skin, but it sent a jolt through her, sharper than the fight. "Doesn't look fine," he muttered, his fingers lingering, tracing the edge of the scratch. Her breath hitched, not from pain, but from the way he stood so close, too close, his heat pressing against her coolness. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. The space between them shrank, the air thick with something unspoken. His hand slid from her shoulder to her jaw, gentle but firm, tilting her face up. His breath was warm against her skin, his heartbeat still wild from the fight, and she felt it echo in her own chest. She could have stopped it, should have, but she didn't. His eyes searched hers, dark and wanting, and then he kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't tentative. It was desperate, raw, like the battle had stripped them bare, and this was all that remained. His lips pressed hard against hers, his hand tightening at the nape of her neck, pulling her closer. She kissed him back, her fingers fisting in his torn jacket, dragging him in, tasting the sweat and dust on him. The world, the Nightclaw's X-47, everything faded, leaving only the heat, the contact, the relief of being alive. When they broke apart, gasping, his forehead rested against hers, his smirk faint but real. "Well," he murmured, voice hoarse, "that's one way to celebrate not dying." Kalia huffed a soft laugh, her grip on his jacket loosening but not letting go. "Shut up," she said, but there was no bite in it. They stayed like that, breathing together, until he spoke again, quieter now. "I didn't build this place just for me," he said, his hand still at her neck, thumb brushing her skin. "Always figured someone might come along. Didn't know it'd be you." She pulled back, just enough to meet his gaze, her heart stuttering. "I stopped looking for a place to belong," she admitted, the words heavy. "Until now." He nodded, his smirk fading into something softer, and they sank down beside the fire, shoulders brushing, the night stretching endless above them. Survival wasn't the only thing that mattered anymore. They'd chosen each other. The days following the Nightclaw attack had woven a fragile truce between Kalia, Elias, and the unforgiving expanse of X-47. What had once been a makeshift shelter, a desperate pile of steel and stone thrown together to defy the storms and predators, had transformed into something more enduring. The wall stood taller now, reinforced with slabs of hull, plating Elias had dragged from a derelict mining rig half buried a mile out. The entrance, once a gaping maw vulnerable to the wind, was framed by a sturdy arch of twisted beams, their edges smoothed by Kalia's careful hands. The roof, a patchwork of scavenged metal sheets, shimmered faintly under the plasma-streaked sky, reflecting the eerie green and violet hues that danced above. Inside, the space had taken on a semblance of life. A fire pit glowed steadily at the center, its warmth seeping into the stone floor, while a corner held their growing stockpile: water flasks, dried roots scavenged from thorny shrubs, and a small arsenal of tools Elias had forged from the planet's wreckage. The air still carried X-47's signature bite, sharp with metal and dust, but it was there as a fragile sanctuary wrested from a world designed to destroy. Kalia stood just beyond the threshold, her emerald eyes tracing the lines of their creation. Her cloak, patched with strips of fabric from her crashed ship, hung loosely over her shoulders, the metallic sheen of her Zarathian skin catching the faint light of the fire within. The wound at her hip had dulled to a distant ache, a scar forming beneath her makeshift bandages, and her strength had returned, steady and sure. She flexed her fingers around the hilt of her sword, now polished to a lethal gleam, its jagged edge a testament to her survival. X-47 hadn't softened, it never would, but she had, in ways she hadn't expected. Not in surrender, but in a quiet shift she couldn't fully name, a thread of something new woven into her resolve. Her gaze drifted to Elias as he stepped into view, and that thread tightened. He emerged from the shadowed waste beyond the cliffside, his silhouette broad and unyielding against the fading plasma glow. Sweat glistened on his bare arms, his shirt tied carelessly around his waist as he hauled a rusted crate over one shoulder. The bandage on his arm was long gone, replaced by a fresh scar that blended seamlessly with the others crisscrossing his bronze skin, a map of battles fought and won, etched in flesh. His dark hair fell in damp strands across his forehead, and he swiped it back with a dirt-streaked hand, his breath fogging briefly in the cooling air. He'd been out there for hours, scavenging parts for a dream he'd only hinted at in passing. Kalia watched him approach, her eyes lingering on the way his muscles shifted with each step, a raw strength that drew her in more than she cared to admit. "Still scavenging?" she called, her voice cutting through the stillness, lighter than it had been in the days of storms and claws. Elias glanced up, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as he dropped the crate near the fire with a dull thud. "Someone's out to keep us from starving," he said, rolling his shoulders to ease the strain. He straightened, brushing dust from his hands, and caught her staring. "You gonna keep watching me like that? Or are you gonna help?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the shelter's frame to mask the flush creeping up her neck. "Only if there's something worth helping with," she shot back, her tone dry, but her eyes sparking with a rare playfulness. His smirk widened, and he stepped closer, his boots scuffing the gravel. "Careful," he said, his voice dropping lower, teasing but edged with something warmer. "Keep talking like that, and I'll think you're starting to like me." Kalia held his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe I am," she said, the words slipping out before she could cage them. His expression flickered, surprise, then a flicker of something deeper, and the air between them thickened, charged with the same tension that had flared after the nightclaws. She straightened, stepping toward him, and for a moment, neither moved, the world narrowing to the space they shared. He broke the standoff first, crouching to pry open the crate with his knife. "Found something out there," he said, his tone shifting to something practical, though his eyes lingered on her a beat longer. The lid popped free, revealing a tangle of wires and a cracked metal box, its surface etched with faded symbols. Kalia knelt beside him, her curiosity piqued, her shoulder brushing his as she peered inside. It was a power cell, corroded, battered, but humming faintly with life beneath the rust. "For what?" she asked, her voice steady despite the warmth of his arm against hers. Elias didn't pull away. "A ship," he said, his words carrying a quiet fire. Not much, just enough to get us off this rock. Been piecing it together in my head since I landed. With this, it might actually work. Kalia's breath caught, her eyes snapping to his. You're serious, she said. Not a question, but a realization. He nodded, setting the cell down and leaning back on his hands, his gaze steady. Dead serious. I didn't survive this long to die here. And now, he paused, his eyes softening as they settled on her. Now I've got a reason to make it happen. Her chest tightened, a warmth blooming within her that she couldn't suppress. She'd spent so long fighting to endure, to prove she wasn't the flaw her people had branded her, that the thought of something beyond survival had never taken root. Until this place. She mirrored his pose, sitting back beside him, their shoulders close enough to share heat. If you build it, she said, her voice soft but resolute, I'll go with you. Elias turned to her, his smirk fading into something raw. Hope, relief, a quiet joy he didn't bother to hide. Good, he said, simple and sure, and the silence that followed was a promise neither needed to voice. Night deepened around them, the plasma sky stretching endless above, its eerie light filtering through the roof seams. They moved inside, settling near the fire, the crate left by the entrance for now. Elias stretched out on a mat of salvaged fabric, hands behind his head, staring up at the patchwork ceiling. Kalia sat beside him, her knees drawn up, her sword within reach, a habit etched too deep to break. The quiet was easy, a stark contrast to the chaos that had forged their bond. You ever think about what's out there? He asked, his voice low, breaking the stillness with a thoughtfulness she hadn't heard before. She tilted her head, considering. Not until now, she admitted. I was too busy surviving, never had the chance to look beyond. He hummed, a deep sound in his throat, and shifted to prop himself on one elbow, facing her. Maybe it's time you did, he said, his eyes locking onto hers, steady and unguarded. We're not just scraping by anymore. This place, it's ours. Something we built. Kalia glanced around, at the walls they'd fortified, the fire they'd tended, the small, stubborn life they'd carved from X-47's ruins. He was right. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a home, a beginning. She met his gaze again, and without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing the scar on his jaw, faint but telling, a mark of the man he'd become. He stilled, his breath catching, but he didn't pull away. You built this alone, she said, her voice a whisper, her hand lingering. Elias shook his head, his own hand rising to cover hers, his calloused fingers warm against her cool skin. Not anymore, he murmured, his thumb tracing her knuckles, a gentle pressure that sent a shiver through her. He sat up fully, closing the distance, his face inches from hers. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, reflecting a depth she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, want, a quiet strength that mirrored her own. She didn't retreat. Her hand slid from his jaw to his neck, her fingers threading through the damp strands of his hair, feeling the pulse beneath her touch. His breath brushed her lips, warm and steady, and she leaned into it, resting her forehead against his. The contact was simple, intimate, a tether in the vastness of X-47. His hand moved to her shoulder, then down her arm, settling at her waist, his grip firm but careful, as if testing the boundaries she'd once held so fiercely. I didn't think I'd find this, she said, her voice barely audible, the confession slipping free. Neither did I, he replied, his tone matching hers, raw and real. His fingers tightened briefly at her waist, pulling her closer, and she let him, her hand resting against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart through the thin fabric of his shirt. The warmth of him seeped into her, a contrast to the coolness of her Zarathian skin, as she closed her eyes, savoring it. The closeness, the quiet, the man who'd become her anchor. They stayed like that, the fire crackling softly, until Elias spoke again, his voice a low rumble. We'll get out of here, he said, a vow wrapped in certainty. Together. She opened her eyes, meeting his, and nodded. Together, she echoed, her hand sliding up to cup his face, her thumb brushing his lips. He turned his head slightly, pressing a soft kiss to her palm, and the gesture, small, unguarded, lit something within her, a spark of hope she hadn't known she could still feel. The night stretched on, and they settled closer, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm draped loosely around her. The plasma sky glowed through the roof, a reminder of the world beyond, but inside, it didn't matter. The camera of their story pulled back, rising slowly from the fire's glow to the shelter's silhouette, then higher still, framing the jagged cliffs against the endless stars. A voice, calm and steady, broke the silence. In a land of death, they found life, not just in survival, but in each other. X-47 wasn't their prison anymore. It was their home, the one they chose. A faint sound cut through the stillness, a distant clang of metal, sharp and unfamiliar. Elias's hand tightened around hers, their eyes meeting in the dark, alert but unafraid. Whatever it was, a ship, a threat, a chance, they'd face it as they'd faced everything else, together.